The night air over the old frontier village carried the smell of smoke, leather, and horses. Lanterns flickered outside the saloon, their dim lights stretching shadows across the dirt road. In those days, when the land was half law and half wilderness, stories of men and tribes traveled quicker than the wind. But none of those tales struck deeper than the one whispered that autumn night of a proud Apache leader and a stubborn cowboy whose paths crossed in the most unexpected way. The cowboy had come from long miles of open plains, dust on his boots, and scars on his hands. He had no family name known in these parts, no fortune to claim, and no promise waiting for him. What he carried was grit, the kind that kept a man standing when others bowed. Folks in the village spoke of him as someone who could not be tamed. A rider who carried both trouble and fate wherever he went. Yet even he could not have imagined that his life would be bound to the daughter of the very chief who mocked him. Apache leader was feared and respected not only by his people, but also by the settlers who built cabins and farms along the edges of tribal land. He was a man whose eyes told of battles fought, treaties broken, and land stolen. He had weathered years of fighting for dignity, watching the world around him change and threaten everything he held sacred. To him, the cowboy was not just another white drifter. He was a symbol of everything that had taken root, where it did not belong. And then there was the daughter. Blind from childhood, fragile in body, yet stubborn in spirit, she was called broken by those who judged only with their eyes. But behind the quiet face and the silence she carried, there was something more in ember, faint but alive, that longed to burn. She lived in the shadows of her father's pride, in the pity of her tribe, hidden away like a forgotten song. No suitor dared to claim her, not for lack of beauty, but because life on the frontier was harsh, and mercy was seldom given to those who appeared weak. So when the chief, in a moment sharp with mockery, offered her to the cowboy, it was not meant as a gift. It was a jest, sharpened like a blade, meant to humiliate. To hand his blind and broken daughter to a man of the plains was to sneer at both the daughter who was unwanted, and the cowboy who was seen as less than worthy. The village laughed, expecting the rider to turn away in shame, to refuse such a match and ride on into the dust. But he did not. The cowboy looked at the chief, then at the young woman whose eyes stared into a darkness only she could know. And instead of stepping back, he did the unthinkable. He gave her his last name. The village fell silent, unsettled. A match that was meant to mock became something else, something that no one could yet understand. The chief's smile faded, for he had expected scorn, not honor. The daughter, though silent, felt her world shift in ways her blindness could not hide. For the first time, someone had not looked away from her, not treated her as broken, but chosen her. That choice set the air thick with tension. The cowboy's decision was more than an act of defiance. It was a spark in a place already heavy with powder. Apache knew this union would not rest quietly. Settlers would whisper. Tribesmen would question. Old wounds would open. As the night stretched long, the saloon doors stayed closed, and the villagers watched from windows. Some thought the cowboy foolish, some thought him brave. The chief, though hardened by years of war, found himself staring into a fire he did not plan. And the daughter, now with a name not her father's but her husband's, stood on the edge of a fate that could either destroy her or set her free. The story was only beginning. The land had not yet spoken its piece. Neither the cowboy nor the Apache leader knew what trials would come from this union, what storms would break against them, what truths would rise from the dust of that old American village. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. And so, as the lanterns burned low and the night fell deeper, the world waited for the first crack of dawn, when pride, love, and destiny would all meet on the same road. For a daughter once mocked as broken now carried a name that tied her to a man who refused to let her be cast aside. But would that name be her shield or her burden? The morning sun broke over the wide hills, throwing long streaks of gold across the village. Roosters crowed from behind fences where weary settlers tried to hold on to their small pieces of land. Horses snorted as the stable boy dragged hay to their stalls. The village looked almost ordinary to anyone riding through dusty streets. A blacksmith hammering at iron, women drawing water from the well butt beneath the quiet work of the day. There was talk, thick and sharp. Everyone had seen what happened the night before, and no one could let it go. The cowboy, still carrying his hat low over his brow, walked the road with a steady step. Some nodded to him, half respectful, half wary, while others looked away. He had lived through whispers before. A man who lived on the saddle knew the sound of gossip as well as the creak of leather. Yet this was different. These whispers carried both disbelief and anger. They spoke of how he had dared to accept the chief's daughter, dared to claim her when no one else would. It was bold, too bold for some. In a place where pride meant survival, choices like his could split a village in two. The Apache leader did not show his thoughts, but he felt them heavy. In his lodge, with smoke curling toward the roof, he sat in silence while his people spoke among themselves. Some were outraged, some were confused, and some shook their heads, saying this was a trick of fate no one could have seen coming. The chief's daughter, blind yet unbowed, sat quietly at his side. She listened to the words she could not escape, feeling every sigh and pause like a hand pressing against her chest. She knew she had been mocked, then suddenly chosen, and now all eyes were on her. For a woman who had been hidden, that weight was heavier than any chain. As for the cowboy, his reasons remained his own. Perhaps it was pity, perhaps it was defiance. Or perhaps he had seen something in her, something beyond her blindness, something that no one else had cared to notice. Folks in the saloon argued it through the morning, mugs of coffee and whiskey in their hands. Some claimed he had done it to shame the chief, to strike pride against pride. Others said it was the move of a reckless man who didn't know the dangers he'd stirred. But a few, the quieter voices, wondered if maybe he had seen her heart, and that was why he gave her his last name. The daughter herself wrestled with questions. Sitting outside as the wind brushed against her face, she traced the patterns of the dirt with her fingers. She had lived in darkness for as long as she could remember, but never had she felt the world press so closely. Her father's shadow had always shielded her, though it carried pity as much as protection. Now she stood in another man's shadow, a cowboy whose name she bore, but whose heart she did not know. She wondered what kind of man would bind himself to her, whether for love, mockery, or something else entirely. Life in the old American village moved on, but beneath it all ran the same undercurrent of unease. Every hammer strike at the blacksmith's forge, every hymn sung from the chapel, every horse drawn through the streets seemed to carry the echo of that night's decision. The settlers and the tribes already lived in fragile peace, one small quarrel away from fire. This strange union felt like a spark waiting to catch. The cowboy did not linger long in town that morning. He rode out toward the open plains, hat tilted, jaw set. His horse carried him across stretches of land that told stories older than fences or saloons. Every mile reminded him of what he had done. He knew the chief's laughter had not been kind, and he knew the villagers' stares were sharp. But he also knew one truth that none of them could touch. When he spoke her name with his, it had felt right. That truth, though simple, weighed more than their jeers. Meanwhile, the chief gathered with his elders. They spoke in low tones of what this meant not just for his daughter, but for his people. Some saw it as a curse, a daughter given away to a settler, a loss of honor. Others wondered if it might bind a fragile bridge, though such thoughts were cautious and rare. The chief, proud as the mountains, struggled to name his own heart. Had his mockery turned against him? Or had fate used his jest to bring forth something? He could not see. The days stretched on, each one thick with waiting. The daughter learned to walk the streets of the village, not as a hidden shadow, but as a woman with a new name. She felt the soil beneath her feet, the voices that hushed when she passed, the warmth of the sun she could not see, but could feel across her skin. Some children whispered cruelly, others looked at her with wide, curious eyes. She did not answer them, but inside her chest, her heart whispered back, "I am not broken." At night, the cowboy often sat outside the lodge, firelight dancing on his face. He would not say much, but his presence was steady. Sometimes he would hum an old trail tune, the kind that carried across plains and rivers. The daughter listened, and though she could not see him, she felt the weight of his silence and the strange comfort of his song. She began to wonder if maybe he was not the fool the village believed him to be. Yet even as something small and quiet grew between them, the storm around them thickened. Settlers from outside the village spoke of betrayal, saying the cowboy had sold himself to the tribe. Some tribesmen muttered of weakness, claiming the chief had dishonored his bloodline. Tension twisted the air, and it seemed only a matter of time before anger turned into something more dangerous. One evening, when the moon hung pale over the hills, the cowboy and the daughter sat near the fire. She reached out, her hand brushing against his arm, and for the first time she asked him why. Why had he spoken her name as his own? Why had he not laughed with the others and turned away? His silence stretched long, broken only by the crack of burning wood. Then he said in a low voice that he had seen enough of the world to know that strength was not always in the eyes or the body. Sometimes it lived where no one bothered to look. She sat still, his words pressing into her heart. For the first time, she felt that maybe he had chosen her, not as a jest, not as pity, but as something real. But before she could speak, a noise stirred in the distance, the faint echo of hoofbeats. Many of them, moving fast across the land, both turned toward the sound, their hearts tightening. For in those days, hoofbeats in the night rarely brought peace. The fire burned low, shadows stretched across the village, and all knew that the choice made days ago was about to bear its cost, and the dawn that followed would not come quietly. The night carried the sound of hoofbeats, like a warning across the plains. In the village, men stepped out of their cabins, rifles in hand, and mothers pulled their children close. The saloon doors swung shut, and the blacksmith stopped his hammer mid-strike. Everyone listened, waiting to see if the riders came as friends or foes. Dust rose on the horizon, pale under the moonlight, and soon figures took shape, settlers from a nearby town. Riding hard and riding angry, they reined their horses at the edge of the village, a tight group of men with hard faces. Their leader, a rancher known for his short temper, raised his voice so all could hear. He shouted that the village had betrayed its own kind, that one of their own, that wandering cowboy, had disgraced himself and brought shame on every settler who had tried to keep peace. The words cut through the air, sharp as a knife. Behind him, the riders muttered, their rifles catching the moonlight like restless snakes. The cowboy stood in front of the lodge, his hand resting near his holster but not yet drawing. He met the rancher's eyes without flinching. He had faced men like him before, men who believed the land belonged only to them, men who saw every bond with the tribes as weakness. But now the stakes were heavier. It wasn't just about him, it was about the woman behind him. She, the chief's daughter who bore his name, and the fragile thread holding the village together. The Apache chief stepped forward, his face like stone. He spoke calmly, yet his words carried fire. He told the settlers that his daughter was not a token to be mocked, nor was she ashamed to be hidden. She had been chosen, and that choice would stand. The settlers spat on the ground, unwilling to accept it. Tension coiled tighter, and for a moment it seemed that rifles would speak before any more words were said. But then the riders turned their horses, promising they would return. Their hoofbeats faded into the night, leaving the village heavy. With silence and unease, the daughter, though blind, felt the storm in every breath around her. She reached out for the cowboy's arm, steadying herself as much as him. In her heart, she knew her presence was the spark that had lit the fuse, though it was not by her will. She carried that weight quietly, listening to the whispers that stirred even among her own people. Some pitied her, some blamed her, and some, more dangerous than either, began to see her as a piece on the board in a game larger than herself. The days that followed were restless. The settlers kept their distance but watched closely. The tribe held meetings late into the night, smoke rising from their fires as voices argued and broke. Some elders believed the union might become a bridge, while others saw only a trap that would end in bloodshed. The chief listened, his pride battling with his fear. He had mocked the cowboy once, but now the joke had turned into a choice that could change more than his daughter's life. The cowboy too felt the strain. He worked where he could, mending fences, helping with horses, trying to show both settlers and tribes that his word was steady. Yet no matter what he did, suspicion clung to him. Men in the saloon muttered that he had betrayed his kind. Tribesmen murmured that he was no true husband, only a rider waiting to disappear. He lived each day under the weight of eyes, but still he did not leave. In the midst of this, the daughter began to find her voice. Though blind, she moved through the village. With quiet courage, her steps careful but sure. She listened to the gossip, to the hymns sung in the chapel, to the laughter of children who did not yet understand the storm around them. Slowly, she began to speak not loudly, but with calm strength. She told her people that she was not broken, that her blindness did not make her less, and that the name she now carried was her choice as much as her husband's. Her words unsettled many. Yet they also sparked a flicker of respect in those who had only seen her as hidden away. Still, the conflict deepened. The settlers began gathering. Weapons and whispers spread of a raid. The tribe prepared as well, sharpening arrows and watching the hills. The village became a place of waiting, like a pot set too close to the fire. Even the air seemed to thicken with what was to come. One night, Cowboy rode out alone, following the trail of the settlers who had threatened them. He wanted answers, maybe even a chance to cool the fire before it consumed them all. He found was worse than he expected. In the ranchers' camp, voices rose in anger, talking of driving the tribe from the land once and for all. They spoke of using the daughter as proof of dishonor, a reason to strike hard and fast. The cowboy stayed hidden, the firelight glinting off his eyes as he listened. When he finally turned back toward the village, his heart was heavy. War was coming whether they wanted it or not. Meanwhile, another conflict brewed quietly. Among the tribe, a young warrior who had long admired the chief's daughter began to speak against the cowboy. He told others that the cowboy's choice was selfish, that no settler could ever be trusted. His words found ears eager for anger, and soon a small group began to follow him. Though he did not speak openly against his leader, the seeds of division took root. The daughter heard his voice. In the gatherings, though she never answered, in her heart, she wondered if loyalty to her people would one day turn them against her. The days grew shorter, and with winter on the horizon, the pressure mounted. Food was scarce, tempers sharper. The cowboy and the daughter found moments of peace together sitting by the fire, walking slowly along the river's edge, but even in those moments, the shadow of what was coming never left them. He told her of the plains, of the rivers that cut like silver through the land of stars she could not see, but might feel in the cold air. She listened, holding those images close, as if they might shield her from the darkness pressing in. The settlers made their move sooner than expected. One evening, scouts reported seeing groups gathering just beyond the ridge. The village prepared, hearts pounding as weapons were readied. The chief stood tall, his daughter at his side, while the cowboy tightened the saddle on his horse. The tension broke into whispers, then into silence. As everyone waited for the first shot, the first cry, the first sign that the fragile peace had shattered, but the night passed without attack. The riders stayed on the ridge, their fires burning, like warning beacons. The waiting became its own kind of torture, and the village held its breath, knowing that dawn would not bring peace, but only another day of dread. The daughter lay awake that night, listening to the wind. She felt the weight of her father's pride, the settler's anger, the tribe's suspicion, and the cowboy's burden. Her heart ached, not just for herself, but for all who stood on the edge of a war none of them truly wanted. She wondered if her name, the one mocked then given, was meant to save or destroy. And outside, beyond the fires, the hoofbeats began again, closer this time, and heavier, carrying the promise that the storm was finally breaking. The hoofbeats, in the distance carried through the night air like a drum before battle. Every villager stirred, every dog barked, and every lantern flickered in windows as people rose from uneasy sleep. The riders did not come storming in as raiders, nor did they vanish into the hills. Instead, they lingered, their fires glowing. Just beyond the ridge, shadows of men and horses moving against the flames. The threat of them was worse than their arrival, for it forced the village to wait, to breathe each hour as if it were borrowed. Inside the chief's lodge, the air was heavy with smoke. Elders sat in a circle, their voices low, but sharp with fear. Some pressed for immediate attack, others for negotiation, but none found true agreement. The cowboy stood at the edge of the gathering, silent, his hand resting on his belt. He had told them what he heard in the settlers' camp, that the rancher wanted war, that his daughter-in-law's name was being used as the excuse, but the words only deepened the divide. For the tribe to strike first would risk annihilation. Yet, to wait was to give their enemies strength. The chief's daughter sat nearby, her hands folded in her lap. She listened to every word, though no one addressed her directly. Her blindness to some made her invisible in these councils. Yet she felt the weight of every voice, every pause, every sigh. She had become the center of a storm, though she had not chosen it, and in her heart she wondered if the land itself was punishing them for a mockery that had turned into something binding. As dawn approached, the cowboy left the lodge and walked to the river's edge. The water reflected the pale light of morning, and he stood there, shoulders stiff, mind burning. He knew the settlers' hatred would not cool. He knew the tribe's patience was thinning. He knew that the name he had given her was now heavier than steel. For a long moment he wished he had ridden on the night the chief mocked him, wished he had kept his distance and left the daughter to the shadows where she had been hidden. But then he thought of her voice calm, even when the world roared. Her quiet courage when others mocked her hand. He knew he would not take back his choice, no matter the cost. The village did not rest in the days that followed. Scouts watched the ridges constantly. Horses stayed saddled, weapons were never far from reach. Settlers from neighboring farms came into town carrying rumors of more riders gathering, of wagons full of supplies being stockpiled. The saloon became a place of arguments. Every man trying to predict whether blood would spill by nightfall or if some miracle of peace would break the tension. Women gathered at the well, their voices hushed, wondering what would become of their children if the ridge riders descended. Among the tribe, the young warrior who had always admired the chief's daughter grew bolder. His voice rose in meetings, speaking of how foolish it was to trust a cowboy with her. He claimed the stranger would abandon her when the guns began to fire, leaving her with nothing but a cursed name. Some listened, nodding in anger, but others held their doubts. They had seen the cowboy's steady presence, seen how he guarded the lodge each night. Still, division grew like cracks in dry earth, and no one could deny the unease it spread. The daughter herself began to sense this unrest. Even more deeply, she could not see their faces, but she felt the coldness of some voices, the hesitation in footsteps when she passed. She carried it quietly, pressing her fingers against the small beads she wore around her neck. Beads her mother had once given her. She prayed not for herself, but for the land, for the people, for the husband she had barely begun to understand. She prayed that the name she bore would not be the stone that sank them all. One evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, a single rider broke away from the ridge and rode into the village. It was the rancher, his coat dusty, his eyes like steel. He carried no weapon in his hands, but his holster was heavy at his side. The villagers watched as he dismounted, dust swirling around him, and called for the chief. His words cut like whips. He demanded the cowboy be handed over, demanded the daughter be returned to her father's house, and promised that if his demands were not met, fire and blood would follow. The chief stood tall, refusing to bend. His voice thundered that his daughter was no longer his to give, that she bore the cowboy's name now, and that their bond was beyond breaking. The rancher laughed, a sound as cold as the night wind, and swore that come the next moon, the ridge would not hold only fires but an army. He mounted his horse and rode back without another word, leaving the village heavier than before. That night, no one slept. The cowboy sat beside the fire, his hand on the rifle across his lap. The daughter sat close, her face tilted toward the flames, though her eyes saw nothing. She asked him if he regretted his choice, and though his heart carried 1,000 doubts, his mouth gave only one truth: no. She smiled faintly, though tears ran down her cheeks, for she knew he had bound himself to her, not only with a name, but with his soul. But even love, or what was beginning to grow into love, could not stop what was coming. Scouts reported that more settlers had joined the ridge. Wagons were arriving, loaded with supplies and weapons. Rumors spread that men from other towns had been called to join the cause, bound together not by law, but by fear and hatred. On the other side, the tribe gathered its warriors, arrows sharpened, rifles cleaned, horses restless. Both sides prepared. Neither willing to yield, the village became a place of waiting. Every sound carried weight. A snapping branch could set hands reaching for rifles. A gust of wind rattling the shutters made children cry. The tension was so thick it seemed to choke the very air. And yet through it all, the daughter walked calmly, her steps steady, her hand sometimes resting lightly on her husband's arm. She told him once, in the stillness of night, that she believed the land chose people for reasons they could not see. Perhaps they had been chosen not to bring peace or war, but simply to face what no one else could. On the final night before, the full moon, when the ridge fires burned brighter than ever, the cowboy rode out once more. He wanted to see with his own eyes the size of the force gathering, crept close under the cover of darkness, his horse quiet beneath him, and what he saw turned his blood cold. There were dozens more than before, wagons lined in rows, rifles stacked high, men sharpening knives and singing harsh songs that carried through the night. He turned back toward the village, his heart heavy with the knowledge that by dawn the storm would break. When he returned, the daughter was waiting at the edge of the lodge, her face lifted as if she could see him through the darkness. She asked. No questions, for she already knew. The air itself told her. The earth beneath her feet trembled with it. She reached for his hand, and he gave it to her, their fingers locking tight. All around them, the village stirred, warriors preparing. Settlers loading rifles, mothers whispering prayers. The chief stood tall in the firelight, his eyes reflecting both pride and sorrow. The young warrior sharpened his blade, his gaze burning with jealousy and anger. The saloon emptied of men, every able hand carrying a weapon. The night was alive with fear and courage, hatred and hope, all clashing in. The shadows before the storm, and then, as the moon climbed high and silver across the sky, the first shot cracked in the distance. The sound echoed through the village like thunder, and every heart stopped, waiting for the flood that would follow. The climax had not yet come, but it was racing toward them, faster than the hoofbeats on the ridge, heavier than the silence before. A storm. And when it arrived, no one in that old American village would ever be the same again. The crack of the first shot split the night, and in an instant the ridge came alive. Horses screamed, rifles fired, and flames rose higher as men charged down toward the village. The air filled with dust and smoke, the kind that clung to the lungs and blurred the line between courage and fear. Women pulled children into cabins, doors slammed shut, and the saloon emptied into the street as men lifted rifles to defend their homes. The tribe's warriors, already waiting, rushed forward with bows, spears, and rifles of their own, their cries rising into the sky like thunder. The cowboy stood in the middle of it all, rifle in hand, jaw tight, eyes sharp. At his side, the chief's daughter remained calm, her hand lightly pressed against his arm. Though blind, she could hear every hoofbeat, every gunshot, every breath of the men around her. She whispered for him to be steady, and though her words were quiet, they carried into his heart stronger than any shout. He kissed her forehead once, then stepped into the chaos, knowing he had no choice but to fight. The settlers charged hard, led by the rancher whose anger had been boiling for weeks. He shouted that the village would burn, that no settler would bow to a chief or his blind daughter, that the cowboy would fall like the fool he was. But the cowboy did not flinch. He met the rider's head-on, rifle cracking, his horse lunging forward. Through the smoke, around him, warriors fought side by side, with settlers who chose loyalty to the village over loyalty to the rancher. The street became a storm, dust mixing with blood, steel clashing against wood, voices rising in fury and fear. The chief stood tall in the center, his voice carrying commands, his eyes never leaving the rancher. Pride burned in him still, but now it was tempered with something deeper, a realization that his daughter's marriage had not been a curse, but a turning point. For years he had fought to keep his people alive, to guard what was sacred. Now he saw that survival sometimes came not through weapons, but through bonds he had not chosen to honor until it was too late. Through the battle, the daughter remained. At the edge of the lodge, listening, waiting, praying, she clutched the beads at her neck, her knuckles white. She could not see the fight, but she felt it every vibration of horses across the earth. Every roar of rifles, every cry of men fighting for pride and for life. She whispered her husband's name again and again, though no one could hear her. But the wind. The fight raged on until the rancher rode through the smoke, his rifle aimed straight at the cowboy. Their eyes met, two men bound by hatred and defiance. The rancher cursed him, swearing that no name given to a broken girl would stand as honor. That the cowboy had doomed them all. He fired, but the shot went wide as the cowboy's horse lunged. In the chaos, the cowboy's rifle spoke back, and the rancher fell, his voice silenced. His anger ended. The Ridge Riders saw their leader fall and faltered. Some dropped their rifles, others fled into the hills, their courage breaking under the weight of defeat. The tribe's warriors pressed them hard, but the chief raised his hand, calling them back. Enough blood had been spilled. The land had seen enough. Slowly, the ridge grew quiet again, the fires dying down, the hoofbeats fading into silence. When the dust settled, the village stood wounded but alive. The saloon doors hung broken, fences lay scattered, and the well had been struck by stray bullets. Yet the people still breathed, and the ground, though scarred, still held them. Settlers and tribesmen alike looked around and realized what had happened. They had stood together. The cowboy, the man mocked as a fool, had not only stood firm, but had helped save them all. The chief walked to where his daughter stood, her face turned toward the fading sounds of battle. For the first time, he placed his hands gently on her shoulders, his voice soft. He told her she was not broken, not shamed, not cursed. She had carried them through this storm with courage no one else had seen. Tears ran down her cheeks as she heard the words she had longed for all her life. The cowboy returned to her side, dirt and smoke covering his face, his rifle heavy in his hand. He touched her cheek softly, whispering that it was over, that she was safe. She reached for him, her fingers finding his, and in that touch there was no mockery, no pity, only truth. Together, they had endured what others thought impossible. Together, they had shown that strength was not in sight, nor in weapons, nor in pride, but in the courage to stand when all others doubted. In the days that followed, the village began to rebuild. Broken fences were mended, cabins patched, wells dug deeper, saloon filled again, though the laughter was quieter now, tempered by what they had survived. Settlers spoke less of division and more of unity. Realizing that their survival depended not on drawing lines, but on holding them together, the tribe, too, found its footing. Seeing that peace was not weakness, but a chance to grow stronger, the young warrior who had once spoken against the cowboy came forward, his pride humbled. He admitted his anger had blinded him, and though he could not let go of all his doubts, he could no longer deny the truth he had seen. The cowboy had stood, and he had stood for the chief's daughter. That was enough to silence his tongue. The chief grew quieter in those days, his pride softened by the weight of what he had nearly lost. He no longer mocked, no longer sneered at weakness, for he had learned that what he once called broken was, in truth, unshakable. His daughter had been his shame, but now she became his strength. And though he did not say it often, in his heart, he knew that the cowboy had been chosen not by him, not by mockery, but by fate itself. As for the daughter, She walked the village with her head high. She could not see the world, but she felt it in every step, every voice that now greeted her with respect instead of whispers. The name she carried was no longer a jest, it was her honor. And though she'd been called blind and broken, she now stood as the symbol of what held the village together when everything threatened to fall apart. The cowboy stayed by her side.
Ow.
Not as a savior, but as a partner. He worked the land, tended the horses, built what needed building. His name became more than his own, it became theirs. Together, they showed that love and strength were not bound by sight or circumstance, but by the courage to walk forward even when the path was hidden. Years later, when the village told stories by firelight, children leaned close as elders spoke of the night the Ridge Riders came. They spoke of the chief who nearly lost his pride, of the cowboy who gave his last name, and of the daughter who was never broken at all. Her story became more than survival. It became a lesson that what the world mocks as weak may be the very thing that saves it. And so, the tale closed where it began, in an old American village, where dust and smoke carried the weight of history. The fires of battle had burned out, but the memory lived on. The cowboy and the daughter walked side by side, not as outcasts, but as proof that honor is not given by men's laughter or scorn, it is forged in the choices that shape a life. Their bond, born from mockery, carried the strength of mountains. And though the world would change, the story of the cowboy and the blind daughter would echo across the plains, carried on the wind, reminding all who listened that sometimes the truest strength is hidden where no one dares to look.